Welcome, intrepid historians. We started Monday's class talking about this data. Today's slide deck is going to go fast because I'm just going to be summarizing the conclusions of those discussions. So we started looking at this data on coronavirus infection rates. The Omicron variant is hypercontagious, so we have 500,000 or more people getting testing positive every day now in the United States. 1 or 2,000 people dying every day. The only good news here is that vaccination rates in the U.S. are on average high. Most Americans are now vaccinated against the virus, so getting less sick and much more likely to survive. The other bit of good news is that Omicron, although hypercontagious, appears to be less severe, so fewer people getting very sick, fewer people landing in the hospital, fewer people dying, that is, fewer people as a percentage of those infected, but because it's so contagious and so many people are getting it, we still, in many parts of the country, have emergency rooms and children's hospitals slammed with admissions and, still, people dying. Bottom left are the states with the highest per capita death rates due to coronavirus. Most of those are states with lower vaccination rates, lower rates of mask and social distancing compliance. And you also see there the states with the lowest coronavirus death rates, including Washington State. These are states with highest vaccination rates, social distancing, and mask compliance rates. Now, from there we shifted to thinking about all the things that we studied from September through December. What's the single most important event we've discussed so far in American history? Most common answer was the American Revolution. It's a good one. Next, students would cite the Columbian Exchange, also very good. Some students cited the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, also excellent. I also asked students to think about what they know of the American history to come and what the most important events to come are. Lots of good answers here. Kids said Civil War, yes. The World Wars, yeah. The Cold War, yeah. Great Depression, yes. And certainly those will all feature. Nobody mentioned the Second Great Awakening, which will be the main course starting on Tuesday in this class this week. So let's review those big three most important events we discussed last year. Here is the Columbian Exchange. Now, Columbian Exchange kicks off with Columbus beginning continuous interaction between the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the New World, North and South America. Old to the Europeans, new to the Europeans. It's their perspective that gets the Old and New Worlds named what they're named. This map suggests that the Columbian Exchange is just about the hemispheres swapping crops and critters, livestock, and diseases. And certainly all those things are important. Especially the disease transmission was devastating for the Western Hemisphere. Afro-Eurasian diseases wipe out more than 90% of the population of North and South America, the Native Americans, in the first century after Columbus's arrival. What's not shown on this map, though, is the movement of people, and the movement of people during the Columbian Exchange is considerable. Now, unfortunately, the meeting of Pocahontas and John Smith is, not all of the interactions between Europeans and Native Americans were this way. In fact, friendship was atypical. Much more common was situations like this. This is the Pequot Massacre, where Pilgrims and other Puritans wiped out much of New England's native population. Right? This was far more typical that European invaders used warfare to eliminate, push out Native Americans. This is not limited to colonial times. It continues when the U.S. gets its independence. Just before Christmas, we talked about Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy. Here are Cherokee being driven on the Trail of Tears from their ancestral homelands in the deep southeast to Oklahoma, west of the Mississippi. The Europeans who are coming over in the Columbian Exchange bring their culture with them. English and British settlers bring with them a growing political tradition of freedom. Here is the Magna Carta, where in 1215 English nobles and bishops forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, giving up some rights to the English people. Needs to get their permission to tax them, needs to guarantee them trial by jury. English settlers and British settlers bring these traditions with them and plant them in the New World. The Magna Carta leads to the institution of Parliament, a representative legislature in Britain, and English and British settlers, as they extend Britain's domain to the eastern seaboard of North America, they bring with them this tradition of representative government. This is the House of Burgesses, a sort of miniature parliament set up in colonial Virginia, and all 13 colonies set up colonial assemblies, their versions of parliament. Not all the movement of people to the New World was voluntary, right? We had, in the few centuries after Columbus, about 4 million Europeans traveling mostly voluntarily to the New World, and at the same time 12 million Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic and subjected to the most brutal and lethal form of slavery ever known to man. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean and Central and South America were most nightmarish. The tobacco and later cotton plantations of what is now the United States were less lethal, but still very brutal and horrific. A persistent myth claims that the colonies were founded mostly by people who came for religious freedom. That's not accurate, although the Pilgrims landing here at Plymouth Rock and other Puritans, John Winthrop, leader of the Great Puritan Migration, came for religious reasons. We can't say that they came for religious freedom, because they, in the domains they controlled in New England, they established a pretty strict Puritan theocracy. Here's Mary Dyer, one of the 4 Boston martyrs, Quakers who tried to preach their version of Christianity in Puritan New England, and they got hanged. If the Puritans had believed in religious freedom, you wouldn't have had Salem witch trials. They would have said, what? Witches? Folks who think, people who think they're witches and worship Satan? Oh, the religious freedom perspective of that is you do you. But the Puritans didn't have that perspective, which is why they jailed like 150 people and executed 20. And yet, religious freedom does become a thing in the 13 colonies because of people resisting the Puritans, like this guy, Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island. He's kicked out of Puritan Massachusetts because he believes in religious freedom, so in Rhode Island sets up a colony based on freedom of religion, separation of church and state. These ideas begin to catch on in colonies outside of New England, and eventually in the 13 colonies, you have more religious freedom than was available back in England. You also had freedom of expression, more of that in the 13 colonies than you had back in Britain. This is an illustration from the Zenger trial, where a German immigrant printer in New York was jailed for criticizing the royal governor of New York. The jury in New York finds him not guilty, establishing a precedent for freedom of the press, that you can, it's okay to criticize the government, including in writing in a newspaper, as long as your criticism is factually accurate. Benjamin Franklin and other newspaper publishers run with this, printing newspapers across the 13 colonies. Benjamin Franklin helped set up the post office in colonial America, and then later in the early United States, to promote the distribution of newspapers and magazines. Thanks to public schools, a good Puritan idea out of New England that begins to spread outside of New England. Between public schools and the newspapers, the colonists are among the most literate and best informed people on Earth. So all of that we file under Columbian Exchange. Everything we just talked about is part of the process of European and African migration to the New World, transforming the New World, and in turn, ideas from the New World eventually transforming the Old World. The second big thing we talked about before Christmas was the American Revolution. And the Revolution we shouldn't equate with the war, right? There is a war that is decisive, but the war is the culmination of the process. We need to think about all the conflicts between the 13 colonies and Britain in from 1763 until 1775, like the Boston Tea Party. All of these acts of resistance, these increasing political quarrels with Britain, are part of the American Revolution. And then in 1775, the war begins. Eventually, the following year they declare independence. George Washington's leadership pivotal on the battlefield. What's with that horse? This is not a fantastic painting. But yeah, that's the American Revolution, the process by which the Americans begin to think and feel of themselves as separate from Europe, separate from Britain and England, and then eventually on the battlefield they make it so. But the American Revolution doesn't end with the end of the war. The legacy of the American Revolution continues. Certainly, Thomas Jefferson, president from 1801 to 1809, saw his administration as extending the principles of the American Revolution, both the principle of equality, right? Jefferson's Democratic Republicans pushing back against what they saw as the elitism of the Federalists, and also pushing for more democracy, government by the people. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans trying to reduce property requirements that barred low-income folks from voting. A couple decades later, Andrew Jackson is president. He has hijacked Jefferson's old Democratic Republican Party. Now it's called the Democratic Party. And Jackson, not content with reducing property restrictions, is all about eliminating them and achieving what he calls universal manhood suffrage. He sees himself very much as an inheritor of the traditions of the American Revolution.